phone rang at 6:14 in the morning and I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. By the time I hung up, I understood something I hadn't let myself admit the night before. Walking away doesn't end a war. Sometimes it's just the first shot. My mother had looked me in the eye on Mother's Day and told me she wished I'd never been born to her. I hadn't argued. I'd simply turned and left. What I didn't know yet was that my leaving would unravel everything she thought she knew about her own family, starting with her favorite son. I drove 3 hours to get to my mother's house that morning, and I remember thinking the whole way that this year would be different. I'd just come off a brutal stretch of training at Fort Campbell, the kind that eats your weekends and your holidays and doesn't apologize for it, and I'd requested this particular leave months in advance because Mother's Day mattered to me. It always had, even when it hadn't mattered to her. I stopped at a florist outside Clarksville and bought her favorite white peonies, the ones she used to grow along the back fence before my father died, and the garden went to seed along with everything else. I'd also spent weeks putting together something more personal than flowers, something I'd tucked into a small wrapped box on the passenger seat, and I kept glancing at it at red lights like it might disappear if I didn't check. The house looked the same as it always did. White shutters, the porch swing my father built still creaking on its chains. My mother's minivan parked crooked in the driveway the way she always parked it. But there was a second car there, too, gleaming and unfamiliar, backed into the spot closest to the door like it belonged there more than I did. That was Ryan's new truck. My younger brother met me at the door before I even reached it, practically vibrating with the news. Mom had co-signed a loan for him, just to help him get back on his feet. He said, though, he'd been back on his feet for years, and this was by my count the third vehicle she'd helped him into since he turned 25. I hugged him anyway. I hugged Emily, his wife, who gave me a tired smile that I filed away without examining too closely. I found my mother in the kitchen apron on, humming along to the radio like nothing in the world was wrong, and for a moment I let myself believe nothing was. Dinner started well enough. My Aunt Carol was there, and a couple of cousins, and the table was loud in the comfortable way big family tables get when nobody's paying close attention to who's talking and who isn't. But somewhere between the mashed potatoes and the pot roast, the conversation folded itself entirely around Ryan, the truck, his promotion at the dealership, the vacation he and Emily were planning. My mother's face lit up every time his name came up. It didn't do that for me. It hadn't done that for me in longer than I wanted to count. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd learned a long time ago how to sit through these dinners without needing anything from them. How to let the attention flow around me like water around a rock. 12 years in the Army teaches you that kind of stillness, if nothing else. But stillness has a cost, and I felt it building behind my ribs as the meal went on, as my mother refilled Ryan's glass without being asked and let mine sit empty. Then Ryan, riding high on the day's admiration, turned to me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Grace only knows the Army," he said loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Family's never really been her priority, has it?" A few people laughed, not cruelly, just the easy laughter of people who don't understand what they've just done. I didn't laugh. I didn't say anything at all. I'd spent a career learning not to react to things designed to provoke a reaction, and I used every bit of that training right then, because something in me understood even before I could name it that this dinner was building towards something worse. When the plates were cleared, I brought out the box I'd carried in from the car. Inside was something I'd spent weeks putting together. I didn't tell her what not yet. I just set it in front of her and watched her face, hoping. My mother looked at it for a long moment. Then she pushed it aside, barely glancing at it the way you'd push aside a piece of mail you didn't feel like opening. She looked at me, really looked at me in a way she hadn't all evening, and said the words I don't think I'll ever fully stop hearing. "I wish you'd never been my daughter." The table went silent. Not the comfortable silence of a lull in conversation, but the kind that has weight to it that presses against your ears. I saw Emily's fork stop halfway to her mouth. I saw Carol's eyes go wide. I saw Ryan for just a second look almost satisfied. I stood up slowly. I looked at my mother for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only 3 or 4 seconds long enough to see that she meant it, or at least that some tired, resentful part of her did. Then I said the only thing that came to me. "Then live as if you never had one." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I walked to the door, got in my SUV, and drove away from that house without looking back at it once in the rearview mirror. That night, alone in a hotel room 40 minutes from the base, I made a decision that would end up changing everything for all of us. Though I couldn't have known that yet, lying there in the dark, staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine, wondering how 32 years had led me to this exact, quiet, devastating moment. The hotel room had that particular kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the television, without checking my phone, just running my mother's words through my mind on a loop, testing them from different angles like I was searching for an exit that wasn't there. I wish you'd never been my daughter. There wasn't an angle that made it hurt less. Somewhere around midnight, something in me shifted. Not sadness exactly. I'd already done my grieving for the version of my mother I kept hoping to find underneath the one who actually existed. What I felt instead was clarity, cold, and practical. The same kind that used to settle over me before a difficult op. If my mother wanted to live as though I'd never been her daughter, I was going to let her find out exactly what that meant. Because here was the truth. Nobody at that table understood the truth I'd never once used as leverage or announced as a favor. For 6 years, I had been quietly keeping my mother's entire financial life afloat. It started small the way these things always do. Her health insurance premium had lapsed 1 month when I was home on leave back when my father's life insurance was running thin, and she was too proud to ask anyone for help. I'd covered it without telling her, called the company myself, put it on auto-pay from my own account. Then it was the property taxes on the house the following spring, when I found the notice unopened on her kitchen counter and didn't have the heart to bring it up with her directly. Then homeowner's insurance. Then, after the derecho tore through the county 3 years back and took half her roof with it, a repair loan I'd taken out in my own name because her credit couldn't carry it, and I didn't want her to feel the shame of that conversation. I never told her. That was deliberate. I didn't want gratitude, and I definitely didn't want it dangled over Ryan's head as evidence of favoritism, because I already knew how that would play in our family. It would somehow become proof that I was trying to buy my way into being loved, rather than what it actually was, which was just taking care of my mother the way I thought a daughter should. Ryan, meanwhile, let her believe he was the one holding things together. He never corrected her. Every time she thanked the family for helping her get by, I watched him accept the credit with a small, easy nod, and I never once said otherwise because correcting him would have meant explaining myself, and I've never been good at asking for credit I didn't think I should need. That night in the hotel room, I stopped being willing to carry a secret that was costing me everything and giving him everything. I opened my laptop around 1 in the morning and logged into my bank's website. My hands were steady, they're trained to be steady, even though something underneath my sternum was not. I found the recurring transfer to Linda Collins' homeowner's insurance and canceled it. I found the automatic payment to the county tax office and canceled that too. I pulled up the repair loan still in my name, still 2 years from being paid off, and I didn't cancel that one. I couldn't legally. It was my debt, but I stopped the auxiliary payment I'd been quietly adding each month to knock it down faster than required. I let it revert to the minimum. In the morning, I called the insurance company, directly identified myself, and asked that all future correspondence and billing be redirected to the property owner, of record my mother, rather than to me as the authorized payer. The representative on the line asked almost gently if I was sure, since I'd been the primary contact on the account for years. I told her yes. I was sure. Then I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Hall, who'd helped me set up my will before my last deployment. I explained the situation in the flattest terms I could manage. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me plainly that every account where I was listed as the paying party could be closed or redirected at my discretion, that I owed my mother nothing beyond what basic decency required, and that basic decency did not include silently financing a household that had just told me I was unwanted in it. She said something else too, something that stuck with me for days afterward, that the kindest thing I could do for everyone involved, including my mother, was to stop protecting her from a truth she needed to see. I want to be clear about something, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story wrong. This wasn't revenge. I didn't cancel those payments to punish her, and I didn't do it with any satisfaction. I did it because I finally understood that I'd spent years absorbing consequences that weren't mine, to absorb shielding people from the natural results of their own choices and calling that love. It wasn't love. It was exhaustion wearing love's clothing, and I was done wearing it. By 9 that morning, I was back on base in uniform, moving through the familiar rhythm of formation and briefings and the particular relief of being somewhere that operated on logic instead of feeling. I didn't check my phone during the day. I told myself I wasn't avoiding anything, I was simply present where I was needed, which had always been true of me, whatever Ryan liked to say at dinner tables. But some part of me knew that somewhere out there, Invisible dominoes were already starting to fall, and that by the next morning, the silence I'd left behind in that house was not going to last. My phone started ringing at 6:14 the next morning, and I let the first 2 calls go, watching the screen light up against the dark of my quarters before I finally reached for it. By the time I checked, there were already 11 missed calls. Within the hour, there would be more than 30. The first one I answered was from a number I didn't recognize, a local Tennessee exchange, and a stranger's voice on the other end asked to speak with Linda Collins regarding an overdue account. I told them calmly that they had the wrong number and hung up before they could argue. That was when I understood this wasn't going to be a quiet morning. My mother called next. I didn't pick up. Then Ryan twice in a row. Then a number I recognized as our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Petrelli, which struck me as strange enough that I almost answered it. But I let that one go too. I made coffee. I got dressed. I told myself I would listen to whatever they had to say once I was ready to hear it, not a second before. Because I already knew that answering too early would mean absorbing someone else's panic before I'd had the chance to feel steady in my own decision. It was Emily's voicemail that finally cracked something open. Her voice was tight, controlled in the particular way people sound when they're trying very hard not to cry in front of whoever might hear them. She said the insurance company had called the house the night before, needed to speak with someone about a lapsed payment. She said the county had sent a notice about property taxes being past due, the kind of notice that comes with a deadline printed in red. She said Ryan's loan on the truck, a loan she hadn't fully understood the terms of until that morning, was somehow tied to a credit line that had just taken a hit. Her voice cracked once when she said, "Grace, I don't understand what's happening. Please call us back." I sat with that voicemail for a while before I called anyone back. Not out of cruelty, out of the simple, unglamorous fact that for 6 years I had absorbed every one of these emergencies alone in silence, without a single person in that house checking whether I had the bandwidth to keep doing it, and I needed a moment to feel what it was like for someone else to sit in that discomfort instead of me. When I finally called Emily back, she answered on the first ring. She didn't waste time on hello. She told me my mother had spent the morning frantic calling the insurance company and the tax office and getting the same answer each time, that the account had been redirected, that the authorized payer of record was no longer covering the balance, that whoever had been paying these bills had stopped. My mother, Emily, said hadn't even known there was a whoever. She genuinely believed Ryan handled all of it. That was the moment I understood how completely he'd let her believe a lie he'd never once corrected. Ryan got on the phone not long after, and his voice had none of the smugness from the dinner table. It was fast, defensive, already reaching for blame before I'd said a word. "What did you do?" he said, like I was the one who'd manufactured a crisis out of nothing. I told him evenly that I hadn't done anything except stop paying bills that had never been mine to pay in the first place. He laughed, short and disbelieving, and said I was trying to punish Mom. That I was trying to blow up the family over one comment made in the heat of a bad night. I let that sit for a second before I answered. I asked him a simple question: how much of the insurance, the taxes, the loan repairs had he personally paid over the last 6 years? There was a pause on the line that told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth to answer. He didn't have a number. He didn't have anything. He tried to pivot, said something about how money isn't the only way to support a family, how presence mattered too, how he'd always been there for Mom in ways I never was because I was always 3 states away in a uniform. I didn't argue that point. I let him have it because arguing wasn't the thing that was going to settle this. The paperwork was going to settle this. I told him calmly that the bank statements would show exactly who had been transferring funds to which accounts for the past 6 years, that the insurance company kept a record of every authorized payer change, that the county tax office had my name on file going back further than his truck had existed. I told him I wasn't interested in a shouting match over the phone, that if he wanted to keep insisting I was the villain in this story, he was welcome to. But the documents weren't going to agree with him. He hung up on me. I sat there for a moment afterward, phone in my hand, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Yet, not vindication exactly, and not guilt either, but a strange, clean kind of relief, the sensation of finally setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I'd been carrying with both arms for years. My mother didn't call again that day. I found out later that she'd spent the afternoon on the phone with the bank herself, asking questions she'd never had to ask before, hearing for the first time a version of the last 6 years that didn't match the story she'd been telling herself. I didn't know yet how deep that unraveling was going to go. but I could feel even from 3 hours away that something in that house had already started coming apart at the seams, and for the first time in a long time it wasn't going to be me holding the thread. Patricia Hall's office sat above a dry cleaner in downtown Clarksville, the kind of unglamorous space that told you she spent her money on being good at her job rather than on decorating around it. I drove there 2 days after the phone calls started, not because I needed her permission to do anything, but because I wanted the truth laid out in black and white before I let myself feel any particular way about it. She'd already pulled together what I'd sent her: 6 years of bank statements, insurance records, the loan paperwork for the roof repair, and spread it across the table in neat chronological stacks. I sat across from her while she walked me through it, and even though I'd lived every one of those transactions, seeing them totaled up on paper hit differently than remembering them one at a time ever had. But it was the second folder that changed the shape of everything. Patricia had done some digging of her own at my request into exactly how deep Ryan's financial entanglements with our mother actually went. What she found went further than either of us expected. There were 3 separate loans over the past 4 years that Ryan had taken out, using our mother's name as either co-signer or guarantor, each one for amounts that didn't match what he'd told her they were for. The truck loan was the smallest of them. There was a personal loan he'd told her was for emergency dental work that had actually gone toward a down payment on a boat he'd sold within 8 months. There was a third larger one where he'd borrowed against the equity in her house itself, using paperwork she'd signed without fully reading to cover gambling debts he'd apparently been carrying since before he and Emily got married. Patricia had also pulled a handful of text messages and emails. Subpoenaed isn't the right word, since nothing was formal at that point. But Emily had voluntarily forwarded them once she started asking her own questions at home. In one thread from 18 months earlier, Ryan had written to a friend that he'd tell their mother, "Grace has it covered," if she ever asked about the house loan, because Grace always has it covered, she won't even notice. Reading that sentence in his own handwriting did something to me that the dinner table comment somehow hadn't. That had been cruelty in the moment, said in anger, maybe even regretted somewhere underneath his pride. This was different. This was calculated. This was years of quietly counting on me to be the invisible safety net under his life, without ever once considering what it cost me to be that. Emily called me that evening, her voice different than it had been on the voicemail, steadier, harder, the voice of someone who has stopped being surprised and started being angry. She told me she'd found the boat sale records herself, buried in an old email account Ryan didn't think she still had access to. She said she'd confronted him the night before, and he'd tried the same tactic he'd used on me: deflection blame, insisting I was the one trying to destroy the family, but she wasn't buying it anymore. "I've been defending him to my own parents for years," she told me. "I didn't know I was defending a liar." I didn't gloat. I want to be honest about that, because it would have been easy to feel something like triumph watching Ryan's version of events collapse under its own weight, and I made a conscious choice not to let myself feel that. Emily was hurting. Whatever Ryan had done to me, he'd done something worse to her. He'd let her build a life on top of debts and deceptions she never agreed to. The final piece came from an unexpected direction. My Uncle Frank, my father's younger brother, called me directly, something he'd never done in all the years since Dad died. He told me he'd heard fragments of what was happening through Emily and wanted to hear it from me. I gave him the short version, the factual version, no embellishment. There was a long pause on the line, and then he said something I hadn't expected. He told me he'd always suspected I was the one keeping things afloat, that he'd noticed years ago how the numbers never quite added up when Linda talked about Ryan's generosity, but he hadn't wanted to cause trouble by saying so. He said he was done staying quiet. He told me he intended to say exactly that to my mother in person the next time he saw her. He kept that promise within the week. I wasn't there for the conversation, but Emily told me about it afterward, how Frank had sat my mother down at her own kitchen table and told her plainly that the family had spent years letting her believe a story that wasn't true, and that he, for one, wasn't going to keep doing it anymore. My mother, according to Emily, hadn't argued with him. She'd just gone very quiet, the way people do when a version of reality they've built their whole understanding around starts to give way beneath them. I didn't feel vindicated so much as tired, the particular tiredness that comes after holding your breath for longer than you realized. Ryan's excuses were running out of oxygen, one relative at a time, and there was no version of this left where he could keep insisting I was the problem. But knowing that didn't undo 6 years of silence, and it didn't erase the words my mother had said to me across that dinner table. Whatever came next was going to have to be built from the ground up, if it got built at all, and I still didn't know if my mother was capable of doing that kind of rebuilding. My mother spent 3 days going through every piece of paper in that house before she called me, and when Emily described it to me afterward, I could picture it exactly. Linda Collins at her kitchen table, with her reading glasses pushed up on her nose, surrounded by a lifetime of manila envelopes and insurance statements. She'd never once thought to read closely, because she'd never had a reason to doubt who was taking care of her. What she found methodically folder by folder was my signature, not Ryan's. Mine on document after document going back years. The homeowner's insurance renewal from 4 years ago, the county tax receipt from the year the assessment jumped, and she'd worried aloud at dinner about how she'd manage it, the loan paperwork for the roof after the derecho. My name listed as the responsible party on line after line, where she'd always assumed without ever checking that her son's name would be. Emily told me later that my mother sat with those papers spread in front of her for over an hour without moving, the house silent except for the refrigerator humming in the next room. It was in the middle of that search that she found the box. I'd almost forgotten about it in the chaos of everything that followed Mother's Day. The box I'd brought that night, the one she'd pushed aside without opening. She found it still wrapped, sitting where she'd left it on the sideboard in the dining room, untouched for a week. Emily said she watched my mother's hands shake slightly as she peeled back the paper, like she already suspected what kind of thing was waiting inside might undo her. Inside was an old photo album I'd put together from pictures I'd been collecting for over a year. Pictures of her and my father from before I was born. Some I'd found in boxes in the garage. Some I'd had restored from damaged originals, arranged with small, handwritten notes beneath each one. Beneath the album was a letter, several pages, that I'd written and rewritten more times than I want to admit, thanking her for things she probably didn't even remember doing, teaching me to drive in the church parking lot on Sunday afternoons, sitting up with me the night before my first deployment. Even though neither of us said much, the specific way she used to hum while she cooked on ordinary evenings that had nothing to do with any holiday at all. And beneath the letter at the bottom of the box was a printed itinerary for a 10-day trip to the Amalfi Coast, booked and paid for. Departure date still 6 weeks out, with both our names on the reservation. I hadn't told her about the trip because I'd wanted it to be a surprise, something to look forward to together after a hard year, a way of saying, without saying it directly, that I still wanted her in my life, even when she made that difficult. I found out afterward that she cried reading that letter in a way Emily said she'd never seen her cry before, not even at my father's funeral. Not the composed, dignified crying my mother usually allowed herself in front of other people. But something raw, something that came from realizing exactly what she'd pushed aside without a second glance on the same night she'd told her own daughter she wished she'd never been born. She called Ryan that same evening, according to Emily, hoping perhaps for some kind of explanation that would make sense of what she was feeling, some context that would soften the shape of what she now understood. Ryan came over, and for a moment Emily thought maybe he was finally going to take responsibility for something. Instead, sitting in the same kitchen where my mother had just spent hours confronting the full architecture of his deceit, the first thing out of his mouth was a question about whether she had any money left over from her savings account, because he had a few things still to sort out before the month was through. Emily told me she watched something in my mother's face close off entirely when he said that. Not anger, exactly. She said it looked more like exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of finally seeing a pattern you've been refusing to see for years, all at once, with no way to unsee it again. My mother didn't yell at him. She didn't cry in front of him the way she had alone with that letter. She simply told him she didn't have anything left to give him right now, and that he should go home to his wife. I heard about all of this secondhand, piece by piece, over the following days, and I let myself feel it slowly rather than all at once. There was no satisfaction in it. Not really. I hadn't wanted my mother broken open by grief and guilt. I'd wanted once, a long time ago, for her to simply see me. Now she was seeing everything all at once, and it was costing her more than I think either of us had expected. I didn't reach out first. I'd learned enough by then to know that whatever came next needed to come from her, needed to be something she chose, rather than something I orchestrated from 3 hours away. So I waited the way I'd learned to wait for orders in situations bigger than myself, trusting that clarity, once it arrives, tends to demand some kind of action from the person who finally has it. She showed up at the base on a Tuesday, and I almost didn't believe the message from the front gate when it came through: Linda Collins requesting to see Major Grace Collins, no appointment. I sat with that notification for a long moment before I told them to let her wait in the visitor center because some part of me needed the extra few minutes to decide who I wanted to be when I walked in there. By the time I arrived, she'd been sitting in that sterile little waiting area for almost 2 hours. I could see it in the way she was sitting, spine, 2 straight hands folded too tightly in her lap, the posture of someone bracing for a door to open on something they're not sure they're ready for. She stood up when she saw me, and for a second neither of us said anything at all. She looked smaller than I remembered her, though I knew that wasn't really true. Grief and shame have a way of making people look like that. We sat across from each other at a plain table in the corner of the room away from the other families waiting there, and she started talking before I'd even fully settled into the chair. She told me she'd gone through every piece of paper in that house. She told me about the box, about the album, about the letter, though I already knew Emily had told me most of it. But I let her say it anyway, because I understood she needed to say it out loud to me, not just have it confirmed secondhand. She cried while she talked quietly without the performance I remembered from other hard conversations over the years. And she said the same thing more than once in different ways, that she'd trusted the wrong person, for reasons that had nothing to do with facts, and everything to do with old worn grooves in how she saw her children. She said Ryan had always been the one who needed protecting ever since he was small. And somewhere along the way that had calcified into a belief that he was also the one who was protecting her, and she'd never once stopped to check whether that belief was true. I let her finish. Then I told her as evenly as I could manage that the thing that hurt the most wasn't actually what she'd said to me on Mother's Day. It was tempting to let her believe that was the whole wound because it would have been a simpler story. One bad night, one cruel sentence, forgivable in the way single mistakes usually are. But that wasn't the truth, and I owed her the truth more than I owed her comfort. I told her the real wound was older than that. Going back to childhood report cards that got a nod while Ryan's got a celebration, to years of watching her light up for him at tables where I sat quietly doing everything asked of me and receiving in return the sense that I had to keep proving I deserved a place in my own family. The comment on Mother's Day hadn't come out of nowhere, I told her. It had just finally said out loud what her actions had been telling me for 30 years. She didn't argue with that. I think if she had, I would have known nothing had actually changed. Instead, she just nodded slowly and said she didn't know how to undo 3 decades of that, but she wanted to try if I'd let her. I told her I forgave her. I meant it when I said it, and I still mean it now. Holding on to that particular kind of anger has never once made me stronger, and I wasn't interested in carrying it as some kind of trophy. But I also told her that forgiveness wasn't the same thing as going back to how things had been, and I needed her to understand the difference before we went any further. I wasn't going to quietly resume paying her insurance and her taxes and covering whatever gaps appeared in her finances, while she directed her warmth toward whichever child was easiest to be warmed toward in the moment. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me going forward, it needed to be one where I wasn't valued primarily for what I provided, and where love didn't have to be earned through invoices. She said she understood. I don't know yet, even now, how fully she understood it in that moment. Some lessons take longer to settle into a person than a single conversation allows for, but I could see something shift in her face, while I spoke something that looked less like defensiveness, and more like a woman finally willing to sit with an uncomfortable truth instead of flinching away from it. Before she left, she asked about the trip. The Amalfi Coast, still 6 weeks out, both our names still on the reservation because I hadn't had the heart to cancel it even in the angriest days after Mother's Day. I told her the offer still stood if she wanted it, but that it would be a different kind of trip than the one I'd originally imagined. Not a peace offering, not a reward for good behavior, just 2 people trying to figure out, honestly, whether they could build something better than what they'd had. She said yes. She said it quickly, like she was afraid I might take the offer back if she hesitated, and for the first time since Mother's Day, I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly, not healed, not yet, but no longer quite so tightly wound either. Ryan sold the truck 6 weeks later. I heard about it from Emily in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone she'd started using for most updates about him. By then, no anger left in it, just the tired precision of someone reporting facts about a person she was already halfway out the door from. He'd needed the money to cover what remained of the boat loan and part of the debt against Mom's house equity, and even after selling it, Emily said he was still short, still scrambling, still calling relatives he hadn't spoken to in years with stories that didn't quite hold together anymore because the one person who used to quietly make his shortfalls disappear had stopped doing that. Emily filed for separation not long after. She told me it wasn't really about the money in the end, even though the money was what had cracked the door open. It was about discovering piece by piece how much of her marriage had been built on things she wasn't allowed to know, debts hidden from her lies told to her own family. On his behalf, a version of himself he'd curated for her that had almost nothing to do with who he actually was when nobody was checking his math. She said she was staying in the area, keeping the modest condo they'd bought together, before the truck, before the boat, before any of it. She sounded steadier than I'd heard her sound in months. The particular steadiness of someone who has stopped waiting for an explanation that was never going to satisfy her anyway. My mother sold the house that summer. I want to be honest and say that surprised me. I'd expected her to hold on to it out of stubbornness, if nothing else. The way people sometimes cling to a house long after it stops making financial sense, simply because letting it go feels like losing the last physical evidence of a life they used to have. But she didn't cling to it. She told me when she called to tell me about the listing, that keeping a house sized for a family of 4 when it was just her rattling around in it alone had started to feel less like comfort, and more like a monument to a version of her life that wasn't coming back. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment closer to town, smaller, easier to manage on her own income. And she told me with something that sounded almost like pride, which I hadn't expected from her, that she'd started keeping her own budget for the first time in years. Tracking every expense herself instead of assuming someone else would catch what she missed. I didn't offer to help her furnish it. That wasn't coldness. It was, I think, both of us learning a new shape for our relationship, one where I wasn't automatically the answer to every gap in her life. She asked a neighbor to help her move the heavier furniture. She asked Emily, of all people, to help her pick out curtains, and the two of them had apparently become close in a way neither of them expected, bonded by having survived the same man's dishonesty from different angles. My mother started going to a part-time job at a fabric store 2 towns over, something she hadn't done since before she married my father. And she told me over the phone one evening, almost shyly, that she liked having somewhere to be that had nothing to do with any of her children at all. A year passed, the way years do when you're not looking directly at them, slowly in the day-to-day, and impossibly fast in the aggregate. I got promoted. That spring orders came through for a new assignment overseas, a real one, the kind that would mean months away and required a kind of readiness I'd been building toward for most of my career. The Amalfi Coast trip happened before any of that in the fall. 10 days that were quieter and more honest than any time I could remember spending with my mother. We didn't talk much about Ryan while we were there. We talked instead about my father, about small things neither of us had ever bothered to say out loud before, about what she wanted the rest of her life to look like, now that she was finally the one deciding. The day before I shipped out, she came to see me off. No speeches this time, no performance for whoever might be watching, none of the old need to be seen a certain way in front of family. Just her standing near my car in the gray early light, looking at me the way I'd wanted her to look at me for as long as I could remember. She didn't say much. She just told me plainly that she was proud to call me her daughter, and something about the simplicity of it landed harder than any elaborate apology could have. I hugged her. It was a different kind of hug than the ones I remembered from childhood, the ones I used to give, hoping they'd be enough to earn something back. This one didn't need to earn anything. It was just 2 people finally standing on something closer to equal ground, choosing each other honestly, instead of out of habit or obligation or old unspoken debts. I think about that Mother's Day. Sometimes the version of me who drove away from that house without looking back, and I don't regret a single mile of that drive. Because I've learned something in the years since that I wish I'd understood decades earlier. Love that only runs in one direction isn't really love at all. It's just quiet exhaustion, wearing a familiar face. And sometimes the most caring thing you can do for a relationship is refuse to keep carrying it alone. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where it found you. Drop a comment and let me know what part stayed with you the longest. We have so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. So make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let's keep this journey going together.